I wonder, are you hot? Better yet, do you think you're hot? Hold on, lest you think I am being inappropriate, let me explain. HOTS is an acronym for Higher Order Thinking Skills. So, if you are hot, that must mean you are a higher order thinker. You might often hear HOTS referred to as critical thinking or creativity, but whatever term you choose to use, HOTS and being a HOT is absolutely essential in the global reality of our 21st century. Let's consider why. We're going to start with the definition of critical thinking. This pretty much forms the basis of HOTS. The definition here is from 2009, which is right about the time that HOTS became an important part of the race to the top criteria and hence also an important part of NCDPI's vision of student, teacher, and expectations. This definition says HOTS includes the ability to make good decisions and to clearly explain the foundation of those decisions. Let's unpack that a bit. The definition has two parts. The first part speaks to a critical thinker's ability to make a good decision. That is, to make a choice or to determine a course of action. Sounds simple enough. But look at that second part. To clearly explain the foundation for those decisions. This is a little bit more complex because this part of the definition entails that a thinker intentionally examines the process behind decision making, the thinking behind the thinking. This process is called metacognition, and it is not as easy as it sounds, nor is it something that we are often asked to do. Think of it this way. One of the quickest ways I know how to drive someone crazy, an adult or a kid, is consistently to ask, why? You start by asking a question and getting an answer. But then reply, why? The person then has to answer why, and maybe another, and sometimes you can get people to explain why once or twice. But if you continue to ask someone why every time, eventually they get pretty angry. They'll probably end up with some kind of response like, because I said so. The need to justify an answer or to explain the thinking behind our thinking is simply not something we as humans do comfortably. It forces metacognition, and we're just not very used to having to explain the ideas behind our ideas. That is, however, precisely what critical thinking and HOTS require. Let's look at some more details about critical thinking, or HOTS. Notice, first of all, that critical thinking starts with the content. In other words, HOTS requires content knowledge. I am often accused of being anti-content, or of being against quantitative discrete knowledge. That's nonsense. All thinking, especially the critical kind, has to start with the ability to acquire and to understand basic content. What I am opposed to, however, is the view of teaching and learning that assumes understanding basic content is enough. I am anti-memorization just for the sake of memorization, because in this day and age of instantaneous access to facts, why on earth would we waste our brain cells in stuffing a bunch of useless facts in our heads that we don't do anything with? But that content and our ability to get it is foundational to critical thinking. Higher order thinkers don't stop with content, though. They rely heavily on the ability to communicate. With others for sure, but higher order thinkers also dialogue within themselves. That might or might not mean they actually talk to themselves, although I'm not certain talking to oneself is a bad thing. Mental dialogue is just important. Critical thinking also involves being able to use resources creatively, in being innovative with information, and in understanding interesting applications for facts and figures. Part of this is the ability for higher order thinkers to evaluate information and to assess the validity of the resources they locate. This is why it is far more important to help kids navigate the internet than it is to shield them from it. One of the stupidest things we do in schools is to have firewalls to take away kids' iPhones or smartphones and to ban the social media that is most used by them. Critical thinking demands that we teach kids to use information and internet access in responsible ways. Finally, critical thinking involves rationalization and metacognition. That is, the ability to articulate why someone believes what he or she believes and how he or she got to that conclusion. For a long time, having an argument was viewed to be a bad thing. But in reality, in the modern world, disagreeing and dialoguing about differences of opinion is exceptionally healthy. If our students are incapable of recognizing divergent positions, respecting dissension, and expressing their own well-rationalized ideas, well, if they can't do that, we have simply not done our jobs as educators. HOTS demands argument. Which brings us back to our friend, Benjamin Bloom. I've already introduced you briefly to Bloom's taxonomy regarding the levels of thinking. This is Bloom's taxonomy for the cognitive domain. If we had more time, we'd also take a look at the taxonomies Bloom created for the affective, that is the emotional and the attitudinal, and the psychomotor, the movement domains. It really is artificial to isolate just the cognitive domain away from the other two, because no thinking really occurs without some kind of affective or psychomotor connection. But for now, we need to limit our discussion of HOTS to Bloom's ideas about cognition. Here is Bloom's taxonomy arranged in our typical triangle shape. Viewed like this, knowledge, which includes the content information that can be memorized, is the broadest and the most foundational kind of thinking that occurs. Everything else in this triangle is quite literally dependent upon it. Starting at the bottom layer, you have to know stuff in order to comprehend it. You have to know and comprehend stuff in order to apply it and to analyze the application. You have to know stuff in order to combine it and synthesize new ideas from it. And you have to know stuff to be able to evaluate how well you have comprehended, applied, analyzed, and synthesized it all. In this model of Bloom, the very most important part of learning are the biggest layers, and those are knowledge and the comprehension of it at the bottom. Application, or the use of the facts and the understandings, is the next most important layer. If you look at a triangle in this shape, you'll see that the triangle would simply keel over and collapse without these big bottom layers. And these big bottom layers are prioritized in exactly that way in a traditional schooling model. Schools spend the majority of time in getting students to know and to comprehend information, and the next priority amount of time in applying it. Although this view is arranged as a chart, it presents the same Bloom's thinking levels. Knowledge is the top left, with the other thinking steps presented in decreasing order of school use below that in the left-hand column. Now look at the words in the right-hand columns. These are verbs that represent the tasks we might assign students at school within each of the levels of thinking. Start at the top and read the verbs associated with each level of thinking. Then think about the assignments and activities that you did when you were back in school. If you are working in a school now or have children of your own, also consider the assignments and activities that our kids today spend most of their classwork and homework time doing. No, really, take some time to look at this chart and to consider it. Okay, did you look at it? Now be honest. Didn't the verbs that are most essential to what goes on in school fall into the first 3 rows, which actually translates to the bottom 3 layers of Bloom's triangle taxonomy? Okay, so now take a look at this. Here is Bloom's taxonomy turned upside down. This view of thinking should really be considered for the 21st century, and it's fairly new. It reprioritizes the same basic categories of thinking. Notice that the areas called declarative content knowledge, knowledge, in this case called remember, comprehension called understand, and application called apply, they're still here, and they're still the foundational 3 layers. But in this model, the bottom layers provide a balancing point rather than a broad-based supporting layer. The largest layer in this model blends the top 3 layers of the Bloom's taxonomy typical triangle: analysis, evaluation, and creativity. These 3 kinds of thinking aren't arranged in a hierarchy. They are all valued equally across the top layer. The top layer of this upside-down taxonomy, blending the 3 thinking tasks of analyzing, evaluating, and creating, represents the layer of HOTS, higher order thinking skills, most valuable for the 21st century. They are still on top, and they still rest upon the lower order declarative content knowledge thinking skills, but as this model indicates, these top-level skills, not remembering, comprehension, or application, are the kinds of thinking that should take up most of learners' time. If schools and schooling involved more HOTS, our learners would be better prepared for the 21st century world that is their future. As teachers, we must view our role as needing to use 21st century HOTS so we can produce media literal critical thinkers. That is, students who can locate and understand a variety of digital media: readings, video, audio, images, and hypertext. Think critically about this media and then apply it to create solutions to real-world problems. This lateral literacy of higher order thinking is what is truly required for 2013 and beyond, not the old school lower order thinking literacy that involves merely reading text to locate information and then being able to write it for pure recall. So if the goal of the 21st century school is to produce higher order thinkers who are media literate, will that really make a difference in what school looks like? Yeah. The goal of critical thinking changes pretty much everything. First, you have to recognize the fact that both we teachers and our current students have been very well trained to conform, to do things the same way, to have the same tasks and the same goals and the same standards, to value the same things and to follow the same procedures. This is a hallmark of the factory system. We are all supposed to be a productive member of the same assembly line and to just get with the program. After all, most of what goes on in school involves getting the right answer, attaining the good grade, or obtaining the passing score. All very convergent and, incidentally, quite competitive tasks. But critical thinking requires an environment geared to difference, not sameness. There is a healthy respect for diversity and an understanding that differences of opinion and lots of pushback, well, they're not only okay, they're highly desirable. You also should know that critical thinking doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Learners still need to be able to access content knowledge, comprehend it, and apply it in very literate and quantifiable ways. But learning that stuff just to learn that stuff and to regurgitate it, well, that really isn't any longer real or valuable learning. In fact, declarative knowledge is pretty disposable nowadays. It only needs to be kept inside a learner's head if it's absolutely necessary. Otherwise, well, heck, the content can be online in some database or on a smartphone for quick access when it's needed. 21st century learning is not really about producing factory workers who all do their part in producing the same product. Our students are highly unlikely to work in a factory of any kind, much less to put their little widgets in a Ford Model T as it moves down the assembly line. Critical thinking has to provide for alternatives, choices in how learners locate and combine information, and choices about how they will create a way to showcase their understanding. Having a bulletin board that displays 24 same student projects, well, that's dead. Critical thinking and higher order thinking also allow for kids to make mistakes, to fail even. The real world requires that its participants have a plan B and a plan C and heck, maybe even a plan Q and Y. Activities in school, then, have to allow kids to take ownership, to take risks, and to take a fallback position if what they have in place and tried just doesn't work. This means that we as teachers need to encourage and to celebrate both the negative and the positive consequences of trying. Can this really be possible if we also only provide a percentage-based grade or a score of pass-fail? Higher order thinking demands that kids have access to information from a variety of viewpoints and technologies. Instead of sheltering our learners, 21st century schools and teachers should give them access to information and then guide them through using this vast quantity of data responsibly, thoughtfully, respectfully, and productively. How else will they learn to distinguish validity, reliability, and the flexibility of thinking that's going to be essential for navigating mid-century 21st century information overload? Finally, our focus in school simply must change from knowledge to understanding, from requiring the same idea at the same time to requiring highly individualized metacognitive activities. There are, of course, many ways in which a necessary shift towards HOTS might impact American schooling. The most essential just might be that we ought not to focus solely on content knowledge, and we should re-examine the ways in which we define success or failure purely in terms of passing or failing quantitative measures. But the reality is that we as classroom teachers have very little ability to change an entire nationwide American school system. Frankly, we also don't want to get fired. So somehow, teachers need to think about how our own pedagogies and methods might be tweaked to be better suited to helping our students prepare themselves for the real world of the 21st century. Maybe ideas about partnering, such as those presented in your Prensky text, might be valuable. This lesson will also provide you with links and readings for resources defining and suggesting something called expert learning, or creating students who are expert learners. As we conclude this lesson on HOTS, reflect about your readings of Prensky and browse these other resources. Finally, I'm going to ask that you do just a little metacognition, higher order thinking, and communication of your own.